The first time my uncle told a sheriff that my grandfather had promised him my farm, I almost believed the argument wasn't really about
The boundary
land.
is right where the fence sits.
Then he
Your
unfolded
fence
an
is
old
10 feet
boundary
onto my
map
property,
with
Uncle
fresh
Thomas.
pencil marks
We need
that
to
had
verify
never
the
been there
markers
before.
before anyone does anything else.
Why would someone change a decades-old survey? Why had the county suddenly pulled records nobody had looked at in years? And why did my uncle smile before anyone had checked a single official document as workers drove steel fence posts into my soybean field? He looked straight at me and said, "You've been farming my land long enough, Bailey." I had no idea that the real boundary
This map
wasn't buried
clearly
in the
shows
soil.
the
It was
boundary
buried
runs right
inside
here.
records someone hoped
These
I would never
soybeans
find.
are on my
If you're watching
property.
from somewhere in the world, tell me your country in the comments. I'd also love to know what time it is where you are right now. And if stories about family truth and standing your ground resonate with you, consider subscribing so we can keep sharing them together. By the time I parked my truck in front of the county records office 2 mornings later, everyone in our little corner of eastern Iowa seemed to have already picked a side. Some people waved when I drove by. Some looked away. A few watched me with the kind of quiet curiosity people reserve for families whose private disagreements have become public entertainment. That was the thing about farming communities. News traveled faster than weather. I shut off the engine and sat for a moment with my hands resting on the steering wheel. I could still hear Uncle Thomas's voice from 2 days earlier. "You've been farming my land long enough." Not our family's land. Not, "There's been a misunderstanding." My land. It was a carefully chosen sentence delivered with complete confidence. That confidence bothered me more than his accusation. Confident people usually believed one of 2 things. Either they were telling the truth, or they believed everyone else would believe them first. I wasn't interested in guessing which one applied to Thomas. I wanted records. Official ones. Before I walked into the records office, my phone rang. Mom. I stared at the screen before answering. "Morning." Her voice sounded tired. "Bailey, your uncle called me." "I'm sure he did. He says you're hiring lawyers." "I'm gathering information." "Does it have to become this?" I closed my eyes. "Mom, he moved a fence into my soybean field." "He believes your grandfather wanted him to have that section. Believing something doesn't make it legal." Silence. Then she sighed. "People are talking." I figured. "They're saying the family is tearing itself apart over property." "No." I looked across the courthouse lawn where an American flag moved gently in the breeze. "The family is being torn apart because someone decided to claim property that already has an owner." She didn't answer immediately. "You know how much your uncle sacrificed for Grandpa." "I know exactly how much." "And your grandfather loved him." "He loved all of us." Another pause. "I just don't want your grandfather's name dragged through court." Neither did I. That was exactly why I was standing outside the county records office, instead of shouting across a fence. "I'll call you later." She quietly said goodbye. I knew she loved me. I also knew she hated conflict so much that she'd spent most of her life pretending difficult problems would solve themselves if everyone stayed polite long enough. Land didn't work that way. Property lines didn't care about family feelings. They either existed or they didn't. Inside the records office, everything smelled faintly of old paper and dust. Behind the front desk sat a woman with silver glasses who introduced herself as Linda. "What can I help you with?" "I need every survey deed, subdivision map, and boundary record connected to Wood's family farm." She smiled. "That's a lot of history." "Our family has been there a while." She typed for several moments. I'll need a few minutes." While I waited, I looked through framed aerial photographs hanging on the wall. One showed our township nearly 40 years earlier. The fields looked almost identical. The same creek, the same gravel roads, the same tree line dividing our farm from Uncle Thomas's property. Some things changed surprisingly little, others changed completely. Linda returned carrying several thick folders. There have been multiple filings over the decades. I frowned. Multiple, she nodded. That's not unusual. She opened one folder. The original deed. Another. Updated tax parcels. Another. Boundary references. Then another. Survey attachments. I began reading. Grandpa Henry had purchased neighboring acreage over several decades, combining smaller parcels into one operating farm. Every purchase included updated legal descriptions. Every update referenced monuments placed by licensed surveyors. Nothing looked unusual until I reached the survey maps. There wasn't just one. There were three. 3 different copies, each showing nearly identical information. Nearly. One carried faded blue ink. One had handwritten notes. One included measurements that appeared cleaner than the others. I leaned closer. They aren't exactly the same. Linda adjusted her glasses. No. Were they revised? I honestly don't know. She checked the file numbers. They were filed at different times. That didn't necessarily mean one replaced another. It could simply mean additional working copies had been archived. Still, why keep several nearly identical versions? I made copies of everything. As I packed them into my folder, Linda asked gently, "Property dispute?" I smiled politely. "I'm hoping it doesn't become one." Outside, I spread the maps across the hood of my truck. The legal descriptions matched. The parcel numbers matched. But tiny handwritten notes appeared on only one version. Small arrows, abbreviations, numbers. Someone had clearly been working through measurements during a survey. Working notes, not legal changes. That distinction already mattered. When I drove home, I stopped at Jack Turner's farm. Jack had lived beside our family longer than I'd been alive. If anyone remembered old survey crews, it would be him. He waved from his machine shed. "Didn't expect to see you today." I've got a question." He invited me inside where the smell of grease and fresh-cut hay filled the air. I spread one of the copied maps across his workbench. "You ever remember Grandpa having the property surveyed?" Jack barely looked before nodding. "Oh, sure." My heart skipped. "When? Oh." He scratched his beard. "Maybe 12 years ago." "You're certain?" "I watched them work for 2 days." "What were they doing?" "They weren't buying or selling land." He thought another moment. "They were replacing old reference measurements." "Replacing?" "The surveyor said the original stone monuments were still good." "Stone monuments?" That phrase caught my attention. Did Grandpa seem worried? Jack laughed softly. "Henry worried about paperwork more than crops." That sounded exactly like Grandpa. He kept saying, "If everything's documented now, nobody can argue later." I looked up. "You remember those exact words?" Jack shrugged. "Something close." He pointed toward the northern fields. "He wanted everything settled before he got too old." I stared toward our property. That wasn't the behavior of a man making secret verbal promises. It was the behavior of someone making sure future generations wouldn't have to rely on memory. Jack continued, "I figured those survey papers would still be around somewhere." "So did I." He frowned. "They're missing. I haven't found them." His expression changed. "That's strange." Driving back to the farm, I couldn't stop thinking about Grandpa's habit of documenting everything. Every seed purchase, every equipment repair, every tax receipt. He labeled file folders by year, season, and project. A man that organized wouldn't simply forget the most important survey of his property. Someone else had, or someone wanted it forgotten. When I reached the farmhouse, I climbed into Grandpa's old office above the equipment garage. The room looked almost untouched. Metal filing cabinets, shelves filled with binders, weather journals, crop rotation notebooks, insurance records dating back decades. I spent hours opening drawer after drawer. Everything was exactly where Grandpa would have left it, except one section. A label remained on an empty folder. County Survey North Boundary, 2014. The folder itself was gone. Only the tab remained. Not misplaced, removed. I stood there staring at the empty space much longer than I should have. Someone hadn't stolen random paperwork. They had known exactly what they were looking for. And for the first time since Thomas had claimed Grandpa promised him my farm, I stopped wondering whether this was simply a family disagreement. Someone had deliberately erased part of the paper trail. As the evening sun disappeared behind the grain bins, my phone buzzed. It was an email notification from Dana Mitchell, the real estate attorney I'd contacted the previous afternoon. The subject line contained only 7 words. I found the survey company. They're still alive. I called Dana before I even closed the email. She answered on the second ring. I had a feeling you'd call immediately. I just found an empty file folder labeled County Survey North Boundary 2014. There was a brief silence. That timing isn't a coincidence. You think someone removed it? I don't know yet, she replied carefully. But I do know the surveying company that handled the project never went out of business. They merged with a larger engineering firm about 6 years ago. So the records might still exist. They usually do. That one sentence lifted a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. Official surveying firms weren't like families. They didn't preserve memories. They preserved paperwork. Can you meet tomorrow morning? Dana asked. I'll be there. Dana Mitchell's office occupied the second floor of a century-old brick building overlooking the town square. Nothing inside tried to impress anyone. No oversized desk. No expensive artwork. Just bookshelves filled with property law engineering references and thick binders organized by county. That alone made me trust her. She greeted me with a firm handshake. You brought everything. I placed copies of the county maps across her conference table. She studied each one without speaking. Nearly 15 minutes passed before she finally looked up. Tell me exactly what your uncle claims. He says Grandpa promised him the North Field. In writing, no. Recorded anywhere, no. Witnesses. He says Grandpa talked about it for years. Dana nodded slowly. People often confuse family conversations with legal transfers. I've noticed. She smiled. I don't mean that disrespectfully. I know. She pulled a legal pad closer. In Iowa, owning land and inheriting land are intentionally difficult processes. She pointed toward one of the maps. If someone wants to transfer real property, there are usually deeds, filings, signatures, acknowledgments, recording dates. What about verbal promises? They may explain someone's expectations. She paused. But they don't replace recorded ownership. It wasn't what I wanted to hear. It was what I already believed. Still, hearing it from someone who handled property disputes every week made it feel more solid. Dana tapped the survey copies. These concern me. The difference is, she nodded, they're working copies. So they aren't evidence. They can become evidence. I frowned. How? They show how surveyors reached their conclusions. She slid another paper toward me. But this, she pointed to the handwritten arrows, isn't a new boundary. It's fieldwork. So Thomas can't use this to prove Grandpa changed the property line? No, she leaned back. Unless there's another document that officially adopted those notes. That was exactly what I needed to know. So where do we look next? The survey company. The engineering office sat 45 minutes away in Cedar Rapids. Unlike the old county building, this place looked modern. Glass walls, computer workstations, drone photographs of farmland hanging along the hallway. A receptionist greeted us warmly before leading us to the records manager. His name was Greg Lawson, late 50s, reading glasses balanced halfway down his nose. Dana introduced us. I'm looking for archived survey files completed around 2014 for Henry Woods. Greg immediately frowned. That's before the merger. I know. Those records are stored off-site. Do they still exist? They should. Should. I was beginning to dislike that word. Greg typed for nearly 5 minutes. His expression slowly changed. Huh. What? There was definitely a project. My pulse quickened. You found it. I found the billing record. Dana and I exchanged a quick glance. Greg continued scrolling. Project number. He read it aloud. North Boundary Verification. Verification, not expansion, not correction. Verification. That single word mattered. What exactly does that mean? I asked. Greg smiled. Usually someone wants confirmation that an existing boundary is correct. So they weren't creating a new one. No, they were checking the old one. Exactly what Jack Turner had remembered. Greg continued. The archived field records should still exist. When can we see them? He hesitated. That's the problem. My stomach tightened. The warehouse inventory was never fully digitized after the merger. Dana crossed her arms. So I have to request physical retrieval. How long? A few days. Not terrible. Not ideal. But there it was, the word I had started to hate. I should warn you. He rotated his monitor toward us. One line appeared beneath the project number. Requested 3 weeks ago. I stared. What? Greg nodded. Someone already requested this archive. When? He pointed again. About 3 weeks ago. Who? I'm afraid I can't disclose that. Dana answered before I could. Can you tell us whether it was a private individual or an attorney? Greg considered that. It was represented by legal counsel. My heartbeat accelerated. Thomas. He had already been here, before confronting me, before moving the fence, before announcing Grandpa's promise. He'd already begun searching for the same records, which meant this wasn't an emotional decision made over Sunday dinner. It had been planned. Carefully. The drive home felt much longer than 45 minutes. Neither Dana nor I spoke much. Finally, she broke the silence. Your uncle anticipated this dispute. I know. He didn't wake up one morning and suddenly remember a promise. I know. He prepared. I gripped the steering wheel. So did someone tell him about the survey? Maybe. Or maybe he already knew. That possibility stayed with me the rest of the drive, because if Thomas knew Grandpa had ordered a verification survey, why wasn't he talking about the survey itself? Why only the supposed promise? The rumors around town became louder over the next several days. At the grocery store, I overheard 2 men discussing the case near the produce section. I heard Henry always meant to split the farm. You sure? That's what Thomas says. Another woman recognized me while I was checking out. I'm praying your family works this out. Thank you. She lowered her voice. People are saying you don't want to share. I smiled politely. I'm asking everyone to wait until all the records are available. She nodded awkwardly. I suppose that's fair. It was remarkable how quickly assumptions became accepted facts when repeated often enough. Thomas wasn't yelling. He wasn't threatening anyone. He was telling a story over and over, and each repetition made it sound a little more true. Mom stopped by the farmhouse that Friday evening. She stood on the porch holding a casserole dish like she had every intention of pretending nothing unusual was happening. I made too much. You always do. She smiled faintly. For a while we talked about the harvest. Rain, corn prices, equipment repairs, normal things. Finally, she looked toward Grandpa's office upstairs. Have you found anything? Not yet. She hesitated. Thomas says you hired an aggressive lawyer. Dana is thorough. He thinks you're trying to embarrass him. I didn't move the fence. Mom looked down. I know. That surprised me. You do. I know you. Her voice softened. You don't start fights. No. But I also don't surrender things that belong to me. She looked as though she wanted to say something else. Instead, she quietly asked, Do you remember Grandpa keeping important papers somewhere besides the office? I thought for a moment. No. She frowned. He used to carry a small leather portfolio. I looked up. A portfolio for meetings. What kind of meetings? I don't know. He always took it whenever he dealt with surveyors, insurance people, bankers. That was new. Completely new. I've never seen it. I haven't either. When was the last time you remember it? She stared out toward the barn. Maybe a year before he passed. After she left, I couldn't stop thinking about that leather portfolio. Grandpa had organized every document in the office. Why carry certain papers separately unless those papers were the ones he never wanted far from him? The next morning, I climbed into the attic above the old machine shed where Grandpa had stored decades of retired equipment and dusty boxes. Most contained ordinary things, seed catalogs, Christmas decorations, broken radios. Then buried beneath an old canvas tarp, I found a small locked metal cash box. Inside was no money, no jewelry, no will, only a faded receipt. At the top in nearly unreadable print were 6 words that made my heart pound. Midwest Land Survey Archives Box 204B. I must have read the receipt 10 times before I accepted what I was looking at. It wasn't a survey. It wasn't a map. It wasn't even a legal document. It was a storage receipt, dated September 18th, 2014. Customer Henry Woods. Reference Project 2Y14B. Location Midwest Land Survey Archives. My grandfather had paid to store something separately from the company's regular records. I turned the faded paper over. Nothing. No handwritten notes, no directions, just the company logo and a customer number that had nearly disappeared with age. I took several photographs before placing the receipt into a plastic document sleeve. Then I called Dana. She answered almost immediately. Please tell me you found something. I found a receipt. She laughed softly. I was hoping for better news. So was I. What kind of receipt? I read every line aloud. The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. Bailey, yeah. That's not ordinary. It isn't. Survey companies archive their own records. So why would Grandpa pay for storage? I honestly don't know. Neither did I. But for the first time since Thomas claimed Grandpa had promised him the Northfield, I felt like I was following Grandpa's trail instead of reacting to my uncle's. Those were 2 very different things. Monday morning, Dana and I drove back to Cedar Rapids. Greg Lawson met us in the lobby. I wasn't expecting to see you again so soon. I handed him the receipt. His eyebrows lifted. I haven't seen one of these in years. You recognize it? Oh, yes. He adjusted his glasses. Before digital storage became reliable, large survey projects were sometimes preserved in climate-controlled archives. So this receipt is legitimate. It appears to be. Dana asked the question that mattered most. Where is box 214B? Greg frowned. It depends. On what? Whether the archive still exists. That answer landed harder than I expected. What do you mean? Several regional storage facilities closed after the merger. He turned toward his computer. "Give me a minute." We waited while he searched. The room was almost completely silent except for the clicking of his keyboard. Finally, he leaned back. "Good news." I hadn't realized I'd been holding my breath. The warehouse wasn't destroyed. "And the box?" He clicked another screen. "It's listed." Dana smiled. "So we can retrieve it." Greg hesitated. "Eventually." There was that word again. Eventually. The archive is managed by a records contractor. "How long?" "They schedule retrievals." "A week." "Usually." I could live with that. Then Greg added something else. "Unless the material is already checked out." Dana and I looked at each other. Greg typed another command. "No." He looked relieved. "It's still there." For the first time in days, I smiled. Not because we'd won anything, because we had found something Thomas apparently hadn't. 2 days later, we drove to a climate-controlled warehouse outside Des Moines. The building looked more like a distribution center than an archive. A woman named Melissa met us at the reception desk. She examined the receipt carefully. "This is old." "So am I," Dana joked. Melissa laughed. "I'll see what we have." Watching archive employees disappear through secured doors became strangely stressful. You never knew whether they would return carrying answers or disappointment. 25 minutes later, Melissa rolled out a gray storage cart. On it sat a long archival box. Across one end was a faded label. 204B. I couldn't help smiling. "There it is." Melissa carefully opened the lid. Inside were dozens of folders wrapped in protective paper. Survey notes, measurement logs, black and white photographs, engineering sketches, original field books. Everything looked untouched. Dana immediately put on cotton gloves. So did I. For the next 2 hours, we reviewed every folder. The material was remarkably organized. Every survey crew member had signed daily logs. Weather conditions had been recorded. Equipment calibration reports were included. Photographs documented each survey marker before and after measurements. Grandpa Henry hadn't simply hired professionals. He had insisted on preserving every step. "This is incredible," I whispered. Dana nodded. "This level of documentation is unusually thorough." One photograph immediately caught my attention. A granite monument partially buried beside an old oak tree. The back of the photo read, "Northwest Original Monument, confirmed intact." I recognized the tree instantly. It still stood today. Another folder contained handwritten field notes, distance measurements, compass bearings, elevation changes, nothing dramatic, just careful engineering, the kind of records people usually ignored because they weren't exciting. Ironically, that was exactly what made them trustworthy. Nobody created paperwork like this for a family argument 10 years later. It had been created simply because that was the surveyor's job. Then Dana stopped turning pages. She stared at one document much longer than the others. "What is it?" She slid it toward me. "Project summary." I scanned the page. Everything appeared routine until the final paragraph. Recommendation: no change to legal boundary. Existing monuments accurately represent recorded property line. No corrective filing required. I looked back at Dana. "Read that again." She did, slowly. "No change to legal boundary." The words seemed almost too simple. Grandpa hadn't ordered a new boundary. He'd ordered confirmation that the existing one was correct. Exactly what Jack Turner had remembered. Exactly what Greg Lawson's billing record suggested. Exactly the opposite of Thomas's story. I almost laughed from relief. "We found it." Dana smiled cautiously. "We found part of it." "What do you mean, this proves the survey?" She tapped the document. It doesn't prove what your uncle knew. She was right. We had evidence. But motive still mattered, especially if Thomas continued claiming Grandpa verbally promised him the land afterward. As we packed the files, Melissa returned. Find what you needed. We found quite a bit. She looked at the paperwork. My father actually worked for Midwest Land Survey. I looked up. Really? She nodded. He retired years ago. Were you around when these surveys were done? I was in college. She smiled. But I remember hearing him talk about one farmer who insisted every photograph be printed twice. My pulse quickened. Twice. One copy for company files, and the other for the client. Grandpa. He said the farmer kept saying. She paused, trying to remember. If people ever argue about this after I'm gone, they'll need more than memories. I felt a lump form in my throat. That sounded exactly like Grandpa Henry. Not angry, not suspicious, just practical, preparing for a disagreement he hoped would never happen. Driving back toward the farm, Dana suddenly asked, "Did your grandfather have a safe?" "I don't think so." "What about a safety deposit box?" "I've never heard of one." She nodded thoughtfully. "If he requested duplicate photographs, you think he kept copies?" "I think Henry Woods trusted documentation." That fit every memory I had of him. Receipts, tax records, maintenance logs, crop journals. He documented everything. So why would he stop with something this important? When I reached home, I found a certified envelope wedged inside my mailbox. Return address, District Court of Cedar County. Inside was a copy of a filing from Thomas's attorney. He was asking the court for a temporary injunction that would prevent me from planting, harvesting, improving, or making changes to the disputed acreage until the case was resolved. If the judge granted it, nearly 30 acres of soybeans would sit untouched during harvest. The financial damage would be immediate. I flipped to the final page. Attached was Thomas's sworn statement. Near the bottom, one sentence stood out. "I have continuously occupied and maintained the disputed property for over 15 years. I stared at the words. Then I slowly looked out my kitchen window toward the north field. I had hundreds of dated drone images, fertilizer invoices, crop insurance inspections, and harvest records covering every season since Grandpa retired. If Thomas truly believed he had maintained that land for 15 years, he had just made a statement that could be checked against every growing season on record. And unlike memories, crops left a paper trail. I spread Thomas's sworn statement across my kitchen table beside 15 years of farm records. One pile contained his words. The other contained my grandfather's habit of documenting everything. I already knew which one I trusted more. The question wasn't whether Thomas had exaggerated. The question was, how much? I called Dana before sunrise. "I read the affidavit." "So did I," she replied. "What do you think?" "I think your uncle just made a claim that's either completely true or very easy to disprove. I've got crop records going back years." "I know. You want all of them." "I want everything." She paused. "And Bailey?" "Yeah. Don't start with the survey." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "Let him keep defending a story that's getting harder to support." That was something Grandpa used to say in a different way. Never interrupt someone while they're building a fence around themselves. Sometimes the gate they're locking is their own. By noon, every flat surface in my farmhouse office was covered with records, harvest reports, crop insurance inspections, seed purchase invoices, fertilizer application logs, drone photographs, property tax files, USDA program paperwork, equipment GPS records. Most people outside agriculture don't realize how much documentation modern farms generate. Nearly every acre leaves a digital footprint. When crops are insured, inspectors record field locations. When fertilizer is applied, licensed operators log acreage. When seed is purchased, planting maps are created. When combines harvest grain yield monitors record exactly where the crop came from. I wasn't trying to build a case after the dispute. I was simply opening files that already existed. That mattered. Evidence created before conflict usually carries far more weight than evidence created afterward. I sorted everything by year, all the way through the current season. Then I noticed something. Every crop insurance inspection identified the same northern boundary, exactly the one Grandpa's survey had confirmed. Not once, every single year. Dana arrived shortly after lunch carrying 2 banker boxes. I brought copies of the county parcel history. She looked around my office and smiled. I see you've been busy. I forgot how much paperwork farming involves. You didn't. She laughed. You just never expected it to become evidence. She began reviewing the crop files. Half an hour later, she stopped. Bailey. What? When did you start using drone mapping? About 8 years ago. You still have the original files, every flight. She looked pleased. Excellent. I raised an eyebrow. Why? Because metadata. I knew the word but wanted her explanation. The photographs don't just show fields. She opened one image. They also record when they were taken. And if someone claims he maintained 30 acres for 15 years, she zoomed into the image. But every aerial survey shows your crops being planted, fertilized, and harvested there. She didn't need to finish. The pictures would speak for themselves. That afternoon, we met Samuel Brooks at the county survey office. He was exactly how I'd imagined an experienced survey investigator. Practical boots, sun-weathered face, calm voice. He shook my hand. Dana tells me you're Bailey Woods. I am. I've read the preliminary file. What do you think? I think people often misunderstand property lines. He spread several maps across the conference table. There are 2 separate questions. He pointed to the first. Where is the legal boundary? Then the second. Who has actually occupied the land? They aren't always the same. I nodded. I understand. He smiled. Most people don't. Samuel explained that fences sometimes remained in the wrong place for decades. Neighbors occasionally farmed small strips without realizing it. Sometimes everyone simply accepted an old mistake. But changing ownership required much more than assumptions. That's why surveys exist. He traced a finger across Grandpa's 2014 project. This one was exceptionally detailed. I noticed. I've reviewed thousands. He looked genuinely impressed. Your grandfather hired professionals who documented nearly everything. I smiled. That sounds like him? Samuel nodded. He wasn't trying to create a new line. He wanted certainty. Exactly. Before we left, Samuel surprised me. I'd like permission to perform a complete field verification. Dana answered immediately. That's exactly what we hoped for. Samuel continued. I don't like relying only on archived documents. You'd rather inspect the original monuments. Every one of them. When? As soon as the court authorizes site access. That made sense. Modern GPS technology was excellent, but surveyors still trusted physical monuments whenever possible, especially those established decades earlier. When I returned home that evening, my mailbox contained another surprise. Not legal papers, a handwritten note. No signature, just one sentence. Some things should stay in the family. I looked around the empty road. Nobody. The paper wasn't threatening. It didn't need to be. Its message was simple. Stop. I carried it inside without saying anything to anyone. Later that night, Mom called. I heard someone left you a note. News traveled impossibly fast. Who told you? I don't know. Of course you don't. She hesitated. Bailey? I'm fine. I wish everyone would stop talking. So do I. I had dinner with Thomas. That caught my attention. Oh, he says this has gone too far. I almost laughed. He started it. He says he only wants what Grandpa intended. What Grandpa intended is exactly what I'm trying to prove. Mom sighed. He looked worried. Not angry, not confident, worried. That was different. Worried about what? I don't know. But he asked whether you'd found the survey. My grip tightened around the phone. He asked that specifically, yes. Not the deed, no. Not the will, no. Just the survey. After we hung up, I sat quietly in Grandpa's office. Thomas wasn't asking about Grandpa's promise anymore. He wasn't asking about witnesses. He wasn't asking about family history. He wanted to know whether I'd found the survey. That meant he understood exactly where the real danger was. Not in stories, in measurements. 3 mornings later, Dana called before breakfast. The county judge signed the access order. So Samuel can inspect tomorrow. I smiled for the first time in days. Finally. Don't celebrate yet. Why not? She sounded unusually serious. I received a copy of your uncle's latest filing. What now? He submitted photographs. Of what? The north boundary. I frowned. So, they supposedly show long-standing fence posts. My stomach tightened. But there's something strange? What? The photographs are dated. That's normal. They're dated 6 years before the model of camera that supposedly took them was ever manufactured. I blinked. That's possible, Dana answered quietly. Not according to the forensic analyst I just hired. For the first time since this dispute began, I realized Thomas's case might not simply be weak. Someone may have tried to manufacture evidence. And if that was true, tomorrow's field survey would be about much more than finding a property line. It could determine which side had been telling the truth from the very beginning. The morning of the field survey began before sunrise. A thin layer of fog rested over the soybean fields, softening everything except the tension. By 7:33, county trucks had pulled onto the gravel lane leading to the north field. Samuel Brooks stepped out first, followed by 2 licensed survey technicians carrying GPS equipment tripods, metal detectors, and bright orange survey flags. Dana arrived a few minutes later. Thomas was already there. He leaned against his pickup with his arms crossed, watching every movement without saying a word. Several neighbors had gathered along the county road. Nobody wanted to interfere, but everyone wanted to see. Samuel walked toward both of us. I appreciate everyone being here. His tone was calm, almost conversational. This isn't a hearing. It isn't an argument. He looked from Thomas to me. My job is to determine where the legal boundary exists, based on recorded evidence and physical monuments. Thomas nodded stiffly. I understand. So do I said. Samuel continued. Once we begin, I need everyone to avoid directing the crew. No suggestions. No assumptions. We follow the evidence. I liked him more with every sentence. The first task seemed surprisingly simple. Rather than measuring from the fence Thomas had recently installed, the crew ignored it completely. Instead, they drove nearly 300 yards south toward a weathered limestone marker near an old oak tree, the same tree I had seen in Grandpa's archived photographs. One technician brushed away years of dirt and grass from the stone. Samuel knelt beside him. There it is. He compared the carving against a copy of the 2014 survey. The numbers matched. Thomas frowned. That's only one marker. Samuel nodded. Correct. One marker proves nothing. Neither does one fence. Thomas didn't respond. The crew attached GPS receivers above the monument and waited while satellites established precise positioning. Even standing there, I could tell the process wasn't dramatic. No one made speeches, no one argued. Surveying was patient work. Measurements, verification, repetition. Exactly the kind of work Grandpa respected. Over the next 2 hours, the technicians located 3 more original monuments. One had shifted slightly because of frost over the years. Another was hidden beneath thick weeds. The last lay almost completely buried beside a drainage ditch. Every location corresponded almost perfectly with the archived records. Samuel looked increasingly satisfied. So far, everything is remarkably consistent. Thomas finally spoke. Those stones could have been moved. Samuel smiled politely. That's always something we consider. Well, the wear patterns suggest they haven't. Thomas folded his arms tighter. What does that mean? Samuel pointed toward the weathered surface. Original survey monuments age in predictable ways. He carefully brushed dirt from the granite. This one has been in place for decades. He wasn't trying to embarrass Thomas. He was simply explaining the science. And science has very little interest in family arguments. Around midday, the crew began calculating the actual property line. One technician carried a prism pole while another worked from the GPS base station. Samuel compared every measurement against both the county records and Grandpa's archived survey. Finally, he walked toward the new steel fence, the one Thomas had ordered installed. He measured the distance, then measured again. One technician quietly repeated the calculation. Samuel checked the numbers himself. Nobody spoke. I could almost hear my own heartbeat. Thomas broke the silence. Well, Samuel looked at him. The fence isn't on the recorded property line. Thomas stared. How far? Samuel checked his tablet. Approximately 38 feet. I watched Thomas blink. No. Samuel remained calm. 38.4 feet at this location. He walked farther east. 36 feet here. Farther again. 39 feet. The pattern remained consistent. The fence hadn't wandered accidentally. It had been installed almost parallel to the real boundary. Just in the wrong place. Thomas shook his head. That's impossible. Samuel didn't argue. Instead, he invited Thomas to stand beside him. Would you like me to explain the measurements? Thomas hesitated before walking over. Samuel showed him the GPS display, then the archived coordinates, then the monument locations. Finally, the legal description. Everything pointed to exactly the same line. Thomas stared at the screen. I've always believed... Samuel interrupted gently. I'm not evaluating beliefs. I'm evaluating evidence. It wasn't a cruel response, just an honest one. One of the technicians raised his hand. Sam. What is it? I think we've got another issue. We followed him about 60 yards north. He had stopped near a shallow grass-covered drainage channel. At first, I couldn't understand why. Then Samuel looked down and sighed. I was wondering if we'd find this. Dana walked closer. What is it? Samuel pointed toward an old concrete marker partly hidden beneath weeds. This isn't private property. It isn't? He shook his head. No. He brushed away more dirt. Cedar County drainage easement. Thomas frowned. What does that have to do with anything? Samuel stood. The fence doesn't just cross Bailey's property. He looked directly at Thomas. It also extends into county drainage land. Silence settled over the field. Even the neighbors along the road seemed to stop talking. I had expected the survey to determine who owned the disputed acreage. I hadn't expected the county itself to become part of the conversation. Dana quietly asked, How significant is that? Samuel answered carefully. The easement exists to allow maintenance of flood control infrastructure. So no one is supposed to permanently obstruct it. Thomas looked genuinely confused. I didn't know. I believe you. Samuel's answer surprised me. There wasn't even a hint of accusation. You don't need to intend to violate an easement, but once it's identified, it has to be corrected. Thomas rubbed the back of his neck. For the first time since all this began, he looked less like a confident man defending his rights, and more like someone realizing he had stepped into something much larger than he'd imagined. The survey wrapped up shortly after 3 in the afternoon. Samuel gathered everyone together. I'll prepare a formal report. When? Dana asked. Within several business days. Thomas looked exhausted. So today proves nothing. Samuel considered the question. No. Thomas's shoulders relaxed slightly. Then Samuel continued. It doesn't prove ownership. It verifies measurements, and measurements become evidence. That distinction mattered, especially in court. As the technicians loaded equipment into their trucks, one of them handed Samuel a small plastic evidence bag. I found this while clearing around the Eastern Monument. Samuel looked inside. What is it? A rusted steel post. Probably left over from an old fence. Except Samuel's expression changed. He examined the post more closely. Then he crouched beside the monument again. His voice became quieter. Interesting. Dana noticed immediately. What did you find? Samuel didn't answer right away. Instead, he carefully photographed the ground before removing anything else. Finally, he stood. This fence post wasn't installed beside the monument. So, I asked, it was driven directly through an older survey stake. Thomas frowned. What difference does that make? Samuel met his eyes. It suggests someone ignored the original survey marker when building a fence. Thomas immediately answered. I didn't install that old fence. I didn't say you did. Samuel sealed the evidence bag. But whoever installed it chose not to follow the surveyed line. I looked toward the weathered remains of the old fence stretching across the north field. For years, everyone, including me, had assumed it represented the property boundary simply because it had always been there. Now I wasn't so sure. Maybe the fence had created the illusion of ownership. Maybe people had slowly begun believing the fence instead of the records. As everyone prepared to leave, Samuel handed Dana a business card. I'll send the completed report directly to the court. Then he looked at me. Ms. Woods? Yes. There's one more agency that needs to review today's findings. What agency? He glanced toward the drainage easement before answering. The County Public Works Department. I frowned. Because of the easement? Yes. What happens then? Why? Samuel slid his notebook into his truck. They'll determine whether the encroachment was accidental. He paused just long enough for me to understand there was another possibility. Or whether someone ignored existing county boundary markers during construction. I spent the next 3 days trying not to imagine every possible outcome. That turned out to be harder than I expected. Once the survey crews left, the farm returned to its normal rhythm. Soybeans still needed checking. Equipment still broke. Invoices still arrived. The corn didn't care that my family was headed toward court. In some ways, I was grateful for that. Routine kept me from replaying every conversation with Thomas, every measurement, every document, every possibility. On Thursday afternoon, Dana called. The court scheduled a mandatory mediation before the hearing. When? Tomorrow morning. I don't suppose Thomas requested it. No. The judge did. That made sense. Property disputes often settled before trial if both sides were willing to compromise. The problem was that I didn't know what there was to compromise. The land either belonged to me or it didn't. There wasn't a middle boundary waiting to be discovered. The mediation took place in a plain conference room inside the county courthouse. No jury, no judge, just a neutral mediator, Dana Thomas, his attorney, and me. The mediator, Robert Gaines, introduced himself before laying out the ground rules. I'm not here to decide who's right. I'm here to see whether this dispute can end without further litigation. Everyone nodded. He looked toward Thomas. Would you like to begin? Thomas folded his hands on the table. For the first time since this started, he didn't sound angry. He sounded tired. I never wanted Bailey to become my enemy. I looked at him without speaking. I spent most of my adult life helping Henry. He stared at the table as he spoke. I repaired fences. I fixed tractors. I planted fields. When Bailey was away at college, I was still here. That part was true. I had gone to Iowa State University. After graduating with a degree in agricultural engineering, I worked for an agricultural technology company in Des Moines for several years before Grandpa's health began declining. When I came home, Thomas had already spent decades farming the neighboring property. No one questioned that. He continued quietly. My father lost his farm during the farm crisis in the 80s. I had heard the story many times. The family almost never talked about it in detail. Thomas did. He spent the rest of his life believing he failed us. His voice caught slightly. I promised myself I'd never lose land again. For the first time, I understood something I hadn't before. This wasn't simply about greed. It was about fear. Fear that had lived inside him for decades. Fear that owning more land meant security. Fear that giving up even a few acres meant failing the family the way he believed his father had failed. Understanding his motivation didn't change the facts, but it changed the man sitting across from me. He wasn't a villain. He was someone whose fear had slowly become certainty. The mediator turned toward me. Bailey. I took a slow breath. I've never denied everything Uncle Thomas has done for Grandpa. He looked up. I know he helped. I know Grandpa depended on him. I know he sacrificed weekends, holidays, and years of work. Thomas's expression softened slightly. But helping someone doesn't automatically transfer ownership. Nobody interrupted. I've spent months looking through Grandpa's records. I've read every survey. I've reviewed every deed. I didn't create those documents. They already existed. I looked directly at Thomas. If Grandpa wanted you to own that field, I honestly believe he would have signed the paperwork. Thomas lowered his eyes. The mediator suggested a short break. Dana and I stepped into the hallway. She handed me a bottle of water. You handled that well. I wasn't trying to win. I know. She leaned against the wall. I've been reviewing something. What? The loan documents. I looked at her. What about them? They explain almost everything. She opened a folder. Thomas refinanced his farm about 4 years ago. I knew he borrowed money. I didn't know how much. She turned one page toward me. The amount surprised even me. It wasn't reckless, but it was significant. Enough to modernize equipment, expand grain storage, replace older machinery. What does this have to do with our case? Dana pointed toward the collateral description. The bank calculated the loan using the productive acreage Thomas represented as part of his farming operation. I frowned. But the disputed acreage belongs to my farm. Exactly. I stared at the page. Are you saying the bank believed he was farming those acres? I'm saying the appraisal included them. Was that legal? Dana chose her words carefully. That depends. On what? Whether the appraiser independently verified every boundary. She closed the folder. I'm not accusing Thomas of fraud, but if the acreage calculation changes, the loan changes. I finally understood why Samuel's discovery about the boundary mattered far beyond our family. This wasn't only about property anymore. The land had been used to support financial decisions. Back inside the mediation room, Robert Gaines asked the obvious question. Mr. Woods, would you consider recognizing the surveyed boundary in exchange for another resolution? Thomas looked at me, then back at the mediator. I can't. Why not? He hesitated longer than at any other point that day. Finally, he answered. Because if I admit the survey is right. His sentence stopped halfway. Nobody spoke. He tried again. I've built too much around believing I own that ground. There it was. Not arrogance, not revenge. Commitment. He had repeated the same belief for so many years that abandoning it now threatened everything connected to it. His reputation, his finances, his identity. The mediator nodded slowly. I appreciate your honesty. The session ended without an agreement. No one slammed doors, no one shouted. We simply gathered our papers. As Thomas reached the hallway, he surprised me. Bailey. I turned. When your grandfather was sick, I know you came home. I should have told him how I felt. I waited. I kept assuming there'd be another harvest. He smiled sadly. There always seemed to be another season. I nodded. He probably would have listened. Maybe. Thomas looked out the courthouse window. Instead, I convinced myself I already knew what he wanted. For a brief moment, I almost wished the dispute had begun years earlier. Maybe then Grandpa could have answered all of this himself. That evening, Dana called again. I've got another update. Good or bad? Depends. I'm listening. The bank hired an independent reviewer after receiving notice of the county survey. So they're checking the appraisal? Yes. I leaned back in my chair. What happens if they conclude the acreage was overstated? They'll require corrections. And Thomas, they'll probably modify the loan. I sighed. I don't want him to lose the farm. I know. Dana's voice became quieter. Fortunately, the reviewer isn't treating this like intentional misconduct. Why? Because the evidence suggests the incorrect fence existed long before Thomas refinanced. That made sense. If the old fence had misled multiple generations, the situation was far more complicated than simple deception. Then Dana added something I hadn't expected. The reviewer called me this afternoon. What did he say? He asked whether your grandfather ever left written instructions explaining why he ordered the 2014 survey. I thought about the archive, the photographs, the project summary, the empty folder in Grandpa's office. No, nothing I've found. Dana was quiet for several seconds. That's interesting. Why? Because the reviewer believes someone recently submitted a document claiming to explain Grandpa's intentions. My stomach tightened. What kind of document? I don't know yet. She exhaled slowly. But whatever it is, it wasn't included in any county record. The courtroom was quieter than I expected. No dramatic whispers, no crowded gallery, just a handful of neighbors, a court reporter, attorneys, and people whose jobs required them to be there. Family disputes rarely looked the way they did on television. They looked ordinary. That was what made them painful. People who had once shared Thanksgiving dinners now sat on opposite sides of the same room, waiting for a judge to decide who had trusted the facts and who had trusted a story. Dana leaned toward me before the hearing began. Remember, I know. Answer only what's asked. I nodded. I will. Across the aisle, Thomas avoided looking at me. He seemed older than he had only a few weeks earlier. Not physically, just heavier. as if every document filed in this case had added another weight he couldn't put down. Judge Patricia Collins entered precisely at 9 o'clock. Everyone stood. After the formalities, she looked over the case file before speaking. I've reviewed the pleadings, the survey records, the affidavits, and the preliminary reports. She looked at both attorneys. My understanding is that ownership itself is not disputed. Thomas's attorney stood. Correct, Your Honor. The recorded title is in Ms. Wood's name. The judge nodded. So today's dispute concerns the location of the legal boundary and the defendant's claim of equitable ownership based on an alleged promise. Exactly. That simple sentence reduced months of family conflict to its legal foundation. Not emotions, not loyalty, evidence. Thomas's attorney gave the opening statement first. He spoke respectfully. He never accused me of dishonesty. Instead, he argued that Grandpa Henry had repeatedly expressed his intention to give the Northfield to Thomas. He relied on that understanding for many years. He improved the property. He maintained it. He believed the existing fence reflected his grandfather's wishes. It was a carefully constructed argument, one based almost entirely on intention. Dana stood next. This case is not about whether Mr. Wood sincerely believed something. She paused. It is about whether that belief changed recorded property ownership. She placed several binders on the evidence table. The documentary record answers that question. Samuel Brooks testified first. He explained his qualifications before describing the survey process in language everyone could understand. We began by locating the original survey monuments. Why? The judge asked. Because monuments control the boundary whenever possible. He described the GPS verification, the archived coordinates, the county records, the 2014 engineering project. Every independent source pointed to the same property line. Judge Collins asked several questions herself. Did you discover evidence that the legal boundary had ever been officially relocated? No, Your Honor. Any corrective filings? No. Any recorded amendments? No. Samuel remained calm throughout. He never exaggerated. He never guessed. Whenever he didn't know something, he simply said so. That honesty made every answer he did give even more credible. Dana introduced the archived survey documents, the photographs, the engineering field books, the project summary. Finally, she displayed the recommendation that Grandpa had paid to preserve. No change to legal boundary. Existing monuments accurately represent recorded property line. Judge Collins read the page carefully. Then she looked toward Thomas's attorney. Do you dispute the authenticity of this document? He stood. No, Your Honor. That answer echoed through the courtroom more loudly than any objection could have. The survey itself was no longer disputed. Thomas then took the witness stand. I hadn't expected to feel nervous, but I did. He looked at the judge before speaking. I loved my brother. He meant Grandpa Henry. I trusted him. I believed him. His voice remained steady. He told me many times that one day I'd have the Northfield. Judge Collins listened without interruption. When was that? Thomas thought for a moment. Over several years. Did he ever execute a deed? No. Any written agreement? No. Any witnesses? Family members heard conversations. The judge nodded. But no written transfer. No. Thomas looked genuinely disappointed by that answer, as though hearing himself say it made him realize how little remained beyond memory. Then came the document Dana had warned me about. Thomas's attorney handed it to the court. We recently located a handwritten note among family papers. Dana immediately stood. We object only to the weight of the document, not its admission. Judge Collins examined it carefully. It appeared to be a brief note in Grandpa's handwriting. It mentioned Thomas. It mentioned the Northfield. At first glance, my heart sank. Had we missed something? The judge looked toward Dana. You may question the witness. Dana walked to the podium. Mr. Woods? Yes. When did you first locate this note? About 2 weeks ago. Where, in an old family Bible? Were there any dates? No. Were there any signatures? No. Were there any witnesses to its discovery? Thomas hesitated. No. Dana nodded. Then she did something I hadn't expected. She walked to the evidence screen and displayed a scanned copy of Grandpa's complete 2014 survey file. One page contained Grandpa's handwritten meeting notes with the survey company. She enlarged several words. Then she enlarged the note Thomas had submitted. Finally, she looked at Samuel Brooks. Mr. Brooks, you've reviewed both documents. I have. Do you notice anything? Samuel adjusted his glasses. The handwriting appears consistent. Thomas relaxed slightly. Then Samuel continued. But the context is completely different. Dana smiled faintly. Please explain. Samuel pointed to Grandpa's original notes. Henry Woods frequently wrote reminders to himself. He pointed to the disputed note. This doesn't read like a transfer of ownership. Judge Collins leaned forward. What does it read like? Samuel answered simply. It reads like a reminder. Dana handed the note to the judge. Written across the bottom was one additional line that had received almost no attention. Check Northfield survey with Thomas before harvest. Judge Collins read it again. Slowly, then a third time. She looked toward Thomas. Mr. Woods? Yes. Isn't it equally possible your brother intended only to review the survey with you? Thomas didn't answer immediately. The courtroom remained silent. I suppose, he swallowed. It's possible. Dana didn't say another word. She didn't need to. The note wasn't a promise. It was a reminder about a conversation that should happen. Nothing more, nothing less. Before closing arguments, Judge Collins asked one final question. Mr. Brooks. Samuel stood. You testified that the current fence is not located on the legal boundary. Correct. And that conclusion is supported by historical surveys, county records, GPS verification, and original monuments. Yes, Your Honor. No conflicting professional survey has been presented? No. The judge made one final note. I understand. She announced a brief recess before issuing her decision. As everyone stood, Dana quietly placed a hand on my shoulder. We're in a good position. I nodded, but before I could answer, the courtroom clerk hurried toward the bench carrying a sealed envelope that had just been delivered. Judge Collins glanced at the return address. Then she looked at both attorneys. It appears the County Public Works Department has submitted its final findings regarding the drainage easement. The judge carefully opened the envelope. Whatever was inside had arrived only minutes before the ruling, and judging by the expression that slowly crossed her face, it was going to matter. Nobody in the courtroom spoke while Judge Collins read the report. The silence lasted less than a minute. It felt much longer. She finished the final page, placed it neatly on the bench, and looked toward both attorneys. I've reviewed the supplemental findings submitted by the Cedar County Public Works Department. She adjusted her glasses. The report is now part of the record. Dana remained perfectly still beside me. Thomas stared at the judge without blinking. Judge Collins continued. The department confirms that the recently installed steel fence extends into an existing county drainage easement. She looked toward Samuel Brooks. Mr. Brooks' survey findings are consistent with the department's independent inspection? Samuel simply nodded. No celebration, no satisfaction, just confirmation. The judge turned another page. The department further concludes there is no evidence that the original county monuments were relocated. I let out a slow breath. Everything now pointed in the same direction. The county records, the archived survey, the GPS verification, the original monuments, the public works inspection. Every independent source supported the same boundary. Judge Collins folded her hands. The court appreciates that this dispute involves a long-standing family relationship. She paused. It is also clear that Mr. Thomas Woods sincerely believed he had a future interest in the disputed acreage. Thomas lowered his eyes. The judge continued. However, sincere belief is not a substitute for legal ownership. No one moved. The evidence presented establishes the following. She began reading from her written findings. The recorded title has remained unchanged. The 2014 professional survey confirmed the existing legal boundary. No corrective filing was recommended. No deed transferring ownership exists. No recorded easement or conveyance altered the property line. She looked directly at Thomas. The court therefore finds that the disputed acreage remains part of Bailey Woods' property. I had expected relief. Instead, I felt strangely quiet. Months of uncertainty disappeared in a single sentence. Not because I had defeated someone, because the truth no longer depended on me explaining it. It had become part of the official record. Judge Collins wasn't finished. The temporary dispute concerning the drainage easement falls within the jurisdiction of Cedar County Public Works. She looked toward Thomas's attorney. The county will determine the appropriate corrective measures. Thomas nodded once. I understand. The judge continued. Based upon the evidence before this court, I find no persuasive evidence that Mr. Woods intentionally attempted to appropriate county land. I glanced toward Thomas. His shoulders relaxed slightly. The more reasonable explanation is that an incorrectly placed historical fence created a mistaken understanding that continued over many years. That mattered. The court recognized the difference between deliberate fraud and a deeply rooted mistake. Thomas had been wrong, but the judge wasn't turning him into a criminal. She was separating facts from assumptions, exactly what the entire case had needed from the beginning. Then came the final order. The defendant shall remove the recently installed fence and restore the disputed acreage to its recorded boundary. The parties shall cooperate with the county survey office regarding monument protection. Future boundary modifications, if any, must comply with Iowa property law. She looked at both of us. This court strongly encourages both parties to preserve the historical survey documentation for future generations. I almost smiled. That sounded exactly like something Grandpa Henry would have wanted. The gavel came down softly. This matter is concluded. Outside the courthouse, reporters weren't waiting. Neither were television cameras. Only a few neighbors stood quietly beneath the courthouse steps. One of them was Jack Turner. He walked over before anyone else. I figured Henry knew what he was doing. I smiled. He usually did. Jack nodded toward the courthouse. He would have hated seeing you two in there. I know. But he also would have hated people arguing without checking the records. Jack laughed. That's even more true. Thomas exited the courthouse several minutes later. His attorney quietly shook his hand before walking toward the parking lot. Thomas remained standing alone for a while, then he slowly approached me. Neither of us spoke immediately. Finally, he said, I owe you something. I waited. An apology. I looked at him. I believed something for so long that I stopped asking whether it was actually true. His voice carried no anger now, only exhaustion. I should have asked your grandfather. You tried to answer the question yourself. He nodded. I did. I'm sorry. I believed him, not because of the apology itself, because he wasn't asking me to change anything. He wasn't asking me to ignore the court's decision. He wasn't asking me to pretend nothing had happened. He simply acknowledged what had happened. Sometimes, that's the most honest apology someone can offer. A week later, county crews removed the steel fence. They replaced several damaged monument markers with protective posts to prevent future disturbance. Samuel Brooks personally inspected the completed work. Everything matched the court order. The north field looked strangely open again, almost unfamiliar. I stood beside the old oak tree where the original granite monument still rested beneath the grass. The same stone Grandpa's surveyors had photographed 12 years earlier. The same stone that had quietly marked the truth while generations argued around it. My phone buzzed. It was Dana. "I've got one last piece of news." I'm almost afraid to ask. She laughed. "You don't need to be." "What is it?" "The bank completed its independent review. And they adjusted Thomas's loan based on the corrected acreage. Is he going to lose the farm? No." I closed my eyes. Thank goodness. They concluded there wasn't enough evidence of intentional misrepresentation. So they just modified the collateral. Exactly. The monthly payments would change. Some refinancing paperwork would have to be updated, but Thomas would keep his farm. I hadn't realized how much I wanted that outcome until Dana said it aloud. Justice didn't require another family farm to disappear. 2 days after harvest began, Mom stopped by unexpectedly. She carried a small wooden box, wrapped in an old kitchen towel. "I found this while cleaning Grandpa's bedroom." I carefully opened it. Inside lay a folded letter. The envelope simply read, "For whoever keeps the farm together." My heartbeat slowed. Grandpa's handwriting. I looked at Mom. "You never saw this?" She shook her head. "No. You should read it." I unfolded the yellowed paper carefully. The first few lines made me smile through unexpected tears. "If you're reading this, then I'm probably no longer around to explain myself. Land has a strange way of making good people remember conversations differently. That's why I trusted surveys, deeds, and records more than memory." I continued reading. Grandpa wrote about Thomas with affection. He thanked him for decades of hard work. He praised his loyalty. Then he explained why he had chosen not to divide the farm. A farm this size survives because it works as one piece. Split it enough times and eventually nobody inherits a farm. They inherit pieces too small to support a family. That wasn't about choosing favorites. It was about protecting the land itself. The final paragraph stayed with me longer than anything else. Whoever owns this farm after me should never confuse kindness with surrender. Love your family. Help them when you can. But let the record speak louder than anyone's memory, including mine. I folded the letter carefully. For months I'd been defending property. Only then did I realize Grandpa had been protecting something much larger. He had been trying to protect future relationships from being destroyed by uncertain memories. I only wished we had found his letter before the first fence post ever went into the ground. Harvest ended under a clear October sky. For the first time in months, I drove across the north field without slowing down to look at the property line. Not because it no longer mattered, because it had finally become ordinary again. The orange survey flags were gone. The temporary stakes had been removed. Only the original granite monuments remained exactly where they had stood for decades. Most people passing the field would never notice them. I did. Every single time. Not because they reminded me of the lawsuit, because they reminded me that the truth doesn't become more or less true depending on how many people argue about it. Some things simply wait to be found. Grandpa's letter stayed on my kitchen table for several days before I could bring myself to read it again. Each time I did, a different sentence stood out. One afternoon, I called Thomas. "Can you come by the farm?" He hesitated. "If that's what you want." "It is." An hour later, his truck rolled into the driveway. Neither of us mentioned the court. Neither of us mentioned the survey. We walked together toward Grandpa's old machine shed, the same place where he had taught both of us how to grease bearings, sharpen mower blades, and fix broken gates instead of replacing them. I handed Thomas the letter. I think Grandpa wanted both of us to read this. He unfolded it carefully. I watched his expression change as he moved down the page. First curiosity, then recognition, then sadness. When he reached the final paragraph, he stopped reading altogether. He simply stared at the paper. I wish he'd handed me this himself. So do I. Thomas folded the letter with the same care Grandpa had always used when putting away important papers. I spent years remembering conversations. He looked across the fields. I never realized I had stopped remembering the man. I understood exactly what he meant. Grandpa hadn't been secretive. He had been methodical. If he intended something important, he wrote it down. Thomas had remembered Grandpa's kindness. He had forgotten Grandpa's habits. That single difference had changed everything. A week later, Thomas invited me to his farm. It felt strange walking into his machine shop after everything we'd been through. He poured 2 cups of coffee before speaking. I've been meeting with the bank. How's it going? It'll take some adjustments. I figured. He smiled. But I'll be all right. I was relieved to hear him say it. I owe you another apology. You already apologized. Not for this. He reached into a folder and slid a document across the table. It was a signed acknowledgement stating that all future fencing drainage work or improvements near our shared boundary would require a licensed survey review before construction. I asked my attorney to draft it. I looked up. You didn't have to. I wanted to. He smiled faintly. I don't trust old fences anymore. I laughed. Neither did I. We both signed the agreement. Not because the law required it, because neither of us wanted another generation standing in a courtroom arguing over memories. Mom came to the farm the following Sunday. She stood beside the porch for a long moment before speaking. I owe you an apology too. You don't owe me anything. I do. She shook her head. I spent too much time worrying about how this family looked. She looked out over Grandpa's fields. I should have worried more about whether we were being honest. I reached over and hugged her. I know why you did it. I was afraid everyone would stop speaking to each other. They almost did. She nodded. And pretending there wasn't a problem nearly made it worse. That was probably the hardest lesson for all of us. Peace built on silence isn't really peace. It's just postponed conflict. Winter arrived earlier than usual that year. The fields rested beneath a thin layer of snow. One afternoon, Jack Turner stopped by with a cardboard box. I found these cleaning out my barn. Inside were several old photographs. Most showed community picnics and county fairs. One picture caught my attention immediately. Grandpa Henry and Thomas stood beside the old oak tree, both smiling while a survey crew worked in the background. Someone had written the date on the back. September 2014, the year of the verification survey. Grandpa had one arm around Thomas's shoulder. There wasn't any tension, no argument, no sign of disagreement. Just 2 men watching professionals do their jobs. Jack smiled. I figured these belonged with you. They belong to both of us. I made copies and delivered one to Thomas the next morning. He looked at the picture for a long time. I'd forgotten this day. I think Grandpa wanted us to remember it. The following spring, Woods Family Farm hosted its first community workshop for young farmers. It wasn't a celebration of the lawsuit. It wasn't even about legal boundaries. It was about stewardship. We invited agricultural students beginning farmers and neighboring landowners to spend a weekend learning about soil health conservation, record-keeping, and modern surveying practices. Samuel Brooks volunteered to give a presentation on why original survey monuments matter. Dana spoke about estate planning in language everyone could understand. She told the audience something that made several people laugh. The cheapest legal document you'll ever prepare is usually the one that prevents the most expensive lawsuit. She wasn't wrong. After the presentations ended, Thomas walked over carrying a box of homemade cookies his wife had baked. He set them on the refreshment table without saying much. Nobody treated him like a villain. Nobody treated me like a hero. We were simply neighbors again. Not exactly the way we had been before. Some things don't return to what they were, and that's all right. Forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. Trust grows back slowly if it grows back at all. The important thing was that neither of us expected the other to pretend the past hadn't happened. Sometimes people ask whether I regret taking the case to court. The answer surprises them. No. I regret that we needed a courtroom to begin listening to evidence. I regret that fear spoke louder than records for so many years. I regret that Grandpa wasn't there to explain what he had already taken the time to document. But I don't regret protecting the farm, because the lawsuit was never really about winning land. It was about protecting the truth attached to that land. The North Field still produces soybeans every other season. The old oak tree still stands near the granite monument. Every now and then I stop for a moment before heading back to work, not to admire the property line, to remember the lesson Grandpa left behind. A boundary isn't only something marked in the ground. Sometimes it's the quiet decision to let facts guide your relationships instead of assumptions. And sometimes the strongest way to honor your family isn't by giving everyone what they want. It's by protecting what they worked so hard to leave behind. The hardest family conflicts are rarely about money alone. They are often about old memories, spoken expectations, and beliefs that slowly become accepted as truth without anyone stopping to verify them. When someone you love insists on a version of the past that doesn't match the facts, setting a boundary may feel like betrayal. In reality, healthy boundaries protect relationships from being built on misunderstandings. If you've ever been pressured to sacrifice your rights just to keep the peace, remember that kindness and self-respect can exist together. Choosing evidence over assumptions is not revenge. Going through the proper legal process is not cruelty. And forgiving someone does not require giving them the same access to your life, your property, or your trust that they once had. Rebuilding trust is a choice, not an obligation. If this story reminded you of an experience in your own family, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective may encourage someone else who is facing a difficult situation. And if you enjoy thoughtful stories about family justice, healing, and resilience, consider subscribing so we can continue these conversations together. This is a fictional story created for entertainment, education, and reflection.